Well, we can go ahead and get started if that's okay because of time, and then folks can catch up as they join. Welcome everyone to the National Campus Compact webinar series for the 2020-2021 academic year. We're so happy that you are able to join us today. While some of us may be in our offices, others of us are at home, we appreciate the time that you carved out of your day for the learning that we'll experience with each other today and at this moment. I'm J.R. Jameson. I'm the executive director of the Indiana Campus Compact, and I will be the host for the webinar today as we have a discussion on pathways of public service and civic engagement. Before we begin, I want to read a quick land statement to acknowledge the land on which we all sit. As a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from today in the chat option on this webinar. I am participating from Muncie, Indiana, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Lenape people and the Miami Nation. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black lives matter. We commit to move beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. I want to go ahead and introduce today's presenters. Gail Robinson from the Gail Robinson Consulting Pathways Consultant. She's an education consultant who works with college and university faculty, staff, and administrators to develop service learning and community engagement programs. She coordinates Stanford's Pathways Working Group and works with the Haas Center staff and outreach efforts to introduce new audiences to Pathways. Ms. Robinson was the Director of Service Learning for the American Association of Community Colleges from 1994 to 2012. We also have Tom Schnaubelt with Stanford University as the Executive Director of the Haas Center for Public Service. Tom has served as the Executive Director at Stanford and has been actively involved in innovative community engagement programs in higher education since 1995. Dr. Schnaubelt developed seminars and courses on community-based learning, national service, education, and social foundations and policy at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, University of Michigan, and at the University of Southern Mississippi. He is the former director of Wisconsin Campus Compact. We also have with us today Annabelle Wong, who also is at Stanford University as a research consultant in the Haas Center for Public Service. She's a former research associate at the Haas Center for Public Service and a graduate of the Stanford Graduate School of Education and the Stanford Public Policy Program. She works with the Haas Center staff to collect and analyze pathways data from participating institutions. Please join me in welcoming our presenters for today's session. And with that, I'll turn it over to them.
All right, thank you, JR. This is Tom, and I'm going to start. Annabelle is going to be driving our slides. So Annabelle, you can move to the first slide, which is, it seems odd to have a slide that has pictures of us because you can see us on your screen, but these are the three people who are presenting today. I will just simply say what a great thrill it's been to work really closely with Annabelle and Gail and one other colleague who's been actively involved but couldn't join today, Joe Wong at the Haas for Public Service. Gail and I have known each other for a long time, and Annabelle actually finished her graduate school years at Stanford as a graduate student worker in the Haas Center. So we had a great working relationship. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. And JR, if you would mind, we were interested just to sort of see what general familiarity people, and so we've got a poll here that we're going to ask you to fill out to tell us whether you are familiar, somewhat familiar, or you just no idea what the pathways are. And while people are taking that poll, I invite you to complete that poll. I'll walk through sort of the general overview for our presentation. We'll do a kind of review of the pathways framework and the survey. We're going to talk about some current and potential uses of the working group members. We have a working group from folks from a wide range of institutions that have helped both with the evolution of the tool and the framework, but are really actively involved in using this on their own campuses. Annabelle will actually share some data highlights, and I think that will really give you a kind of snapshot of how this tool and the framework might be used. And then we're going to try to have as much time as possible for discussion and just next steps. So JR, could you see, let's take a look and see what people are, where people are at with familiarity with the poll. All right, so it looks like about 60% of you haven't any familiarity. So that's good, because we're going to sort of start from the ground up here. Annabelle, could you go to the next slide, please? All right, so I'm going to share a little bit about the sort of evolution and the rationale behind the pathways of public service and civic engagement, and talk a little bit about the goals and how this thing got going. I need to say, first and foremost, our goal really in starting all of this was to have students develop the knowledge, the skills, the identity, and the values, and the practices of adaptive leadership, so that they can incorporate service into the work in any sector, and any work across sectors to create positive social change. And our role really is to help the students get there. When I think about the evolution of this tool, of the framework, it's really on two levels. One is the work that we do at the local level with our students, and the other is the work of the field. And I'll say that I came to the Stanford University's Haas Center in 2009, and in 2010 we were just finishing up some strategic planning. And during that time, I began to notice in some of our students a certain kind of angularity and a lot of misinformation. And I'll give you an anecdote that will maybe make that clear. I went to an event where a student, it was one of these showcase events where students were pitching ideas, and a student came up to me who had been involved in creating a company that was selling bottled water and then donating the proceeds to places in Africa where they were building wells. So they were trying to create clean water. And I asked the person, have you set up a nonprofit? And the person looked at me and said, I'm not interested at all in developing a nonprofit. I don't want to be beholden to donors, and nonprofits can't advertise. I'm a social entrepreneur. And I just was like, wow, that's really interesting. There's so much to unpack there, that's just misinformation. And the student really had an angular view of themselves. So that launched, not just that, but a number of those kinds of interactions got us to thinking, how can we figure out a way where students can sort of see different levers of social change and be able to pull and put together an intellectual framework that presents that to them. So at the time, we started working with our colleagues at the UC Berkeley Public Service Center and St. Mary's College, and came up with an initial sort of, here's a bunch of different ways that students can get involved. And that ultimately became the first iteration of the pathways of public service and civic engagement. And here is where I really want to plug and sort of acknowledge Minnesota Campus Compact. Those of you that know Minnesota Campus Compact, they have a great social change wheel. It's much larger. It has a lot more to it. Ours is kind of the pathways of public service and civic engagement is much more of a distillation, and it's a broader typology. But our initial use at the Haas Center was really around advising students. So that's sort of how it came to be. Initially, there was a second level that this was happening too, and that was at the field level, where those of you that have been involved in the field for a long time, you've probably been to a conference or a meeting where it's like, you're kind of wondering, is everybody talking about the same thing? We have different language that really covers this. It's really hard to know. I mean, the one point of clarity that we got at one point was whether we should use the hyphen or not within service learning. But there was so much sort of lack of clarity about the language between institutions. And that really limits our ability as a field to do any kind of cross-institution comparison, to sort of understand what are we doing. So that was the second piece. And I'll give you one example there too. St. Mary's College, when we were doing that, sort of piloting it, I remember Marshall saying to me, you know, our students at St. Mary's College won't be interested in social entrepreneurship at all. Your Stanford students, that's the hub of it, is social entrepreneurship and social innovation. Well, it turned out when we did the first survey, his students were actually the same level of sort of interest or predisposition around social entrepreneurship. So it was really helpful for him to sort of see that, like, oh, I had no idea that there was that much interest. The quantum leap in all of the evolution of this was actually the formation of this working group, the thing that you will ultimately be invited to connect with. And this working group really kind of coincided with our bringing Gail along and saying, hey, Gail, there's not many two-year colleges that are involved in this. Help us think through the language, help us, you know, find more two-year institutions that might be involved in this. And that working group is really then every year kind of made some tweaks and modifications to our framework and our tool. And Annabelle, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. So this is the pathway sort of graphic that we have. And I know you can't, it's probably really hard to read this. Maybe you have, I'm gonna put into the chat a link that you can download this graphic for yourself and make it bigger if you need to. But these are the 6 pathways that we came up with. And there's the 6 are community engaged learning and research, direct service, policy and governance, community organizing and activism, philanthropy, and then social entrepreneurship and corporate social responsibility. Now, as you can see, those are really big buckets, right? And I will tell you right away, there's lots of talk, lots of conversations that sort of, what do they mean? What do they hold? And over time, we feel like we've gotten a really good sort of representation for here's 6 levers of social change that are, they're all going to be overlapping. There's pieces of these things. It's not a perfect typology by any stretch of the imagination. So for instance, we have lots of conversations with students and with our colleagues about where does community organizing and activism and policy and governance stop and start. There's not. But what this does is it represents kind of a theory of change or an intellectual framework that doesn't pit one against the other. I don't know if those of you that might have been around in the 80s or 90s probably remember this, you know, it's change, not charity. It's sort of like the philanthropy bad, sort of social justice and other forms of change good. And you know, my own predisposition is that I don't like binaries. I like to have things more complicated than that. And this definitely does that. So we're asking students to sort of think about this intellectual framework, this for social change, in ways that they take with them through their life. And so they become sort of aware that I might not be sort of an organizer or an activist, but at least I understand that as a form of social change, a really valuable form of social change. And so with that as a backdrop for the work, I'm going to turn it over to Gail, who's going to say a little bit more about how the tool gets used and sort of share a little bit about the tool itself.
Thanks, Tom. There we go. So here we are at the beginning of the Pathway Survey. And I shared the URL, the bit.ly that's up in the upper right-hand part of the screen. I shared that in the chat a little bit earlier. That will take you to the homepage of the Pathways Working Group. And that's, as Tom mentioned, the cohort of higher ed institutions around the country that participate and use the framework and the survey. So there you can find a demonstration version of the survey that doesn't collect any data. So you can try it for yourself. You can share it with other colleagues on campus, and it won't interfere with the data that we're collecting on students. The survey takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete. And then if you decide to use the survey with your students, we'd provide you with a private link through Qualtrics that will be specific to your college or university. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the survey attempts to measure students' proclivities toward public service and civic engagement. This first screen that students will see explains the purpose of the survey, introduces the framework, and notes that all responses are confidential. We don't collect any identifying information from students. All we have are date and time stamps. So and the Stanford's IRB has approved this if that's an issue on your own campus. Annabelle, next. Okay, here, the first activity in the survey asks respondents to select and rank example activities that are interesting to them. So you see those along the left side of the screen. And this is a drag and drop activity. So students would select activities that are interesting, and they just don't select anything that's not interesting, and then they can sort them by priority. Each activity in this list is associated with a specific pathway, and those selected will be shown its pathways on their results page. And again, we'll see that in a little bit. Next, we asked respondents to identify their top issues or concerns on their campus, in their region, and in the world, in their own words. So while the themes from each year may be similar, we can see if the words themselves change. Like early on, students would mention global warming, and now the phrase they tend to use is climate change. These themes can give you ideas for how to create new campus programming or courses to address the topics that students are interested in. Next. Here we provide 6 topic-specific options for students to select from. So each of these topics has its own examples in the rest of the survey. Here in this example that we're showing today, we've selected diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all of the questions that you'll see on the remaining slides will relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And at the bottom of the page, you see 2 of the pathways with their icons, colors, and descriptions, and all 6 of them show up on the screen that students would see. Each pathway has its own screen or page, which contains the definition and the icon at the top. So here it's community organizing and activism, followed by examples that are relevant to the topic area that the respondent previously selected. So again, in this case, diversity, equity, and inclusion examples. And then it also gives career examples for that particular pathway. Then the second half of the screen, 4 identical questions appear for each pathway regarding how much experience students have in the pathway, how much interest they have in exploring the pathway during college, given their strengths, how much impact they personally could have, and then in general, how much impact you think the pathway has on social issues. So again, they'll see 6 of those slides successively on each of the 6 pathways. And then at the end of those questions about each pathway, there are these 2 final questions about which pathways students would be most likely to pursue after college, and a question about whether they participated in a pathways workshop. So that might help you for your own internal organizing. And the first question is used in the results as a tiebreaker in the event of multiple top choices. Next we have demographic information that we collect on students, and this is, again, it's optional, just like everything, all the questions in the survey are. We use this to compare data between various groups and the different institutions that are part of our working group, and you'll see some of this reflected in the data that Annabelle's going to show you in a little bit. Here we have the results page that pops up once the students have completed all the survey questions. The top 2 pathways by description are those where students scored particular examples in the survey more highly by responding that they had either some or a lot of experience or interest. So in this case, you see it's policy and governance and community engaged learning and research in the sample. The pathway that appears under I believe I can personally create the most impact is determined by the student's highest response to the questions regarding their personal strengths. And the next one, I believe the most impact can be generated. That's determined by the student's highest responses to the question regarding general impact. So all hopefully fairly clear. Sometimes we find that the results surprise students, and then for others, it just confirms what they already know about themselves. And if you scroll down this page, if you were on the survey live, you see the other 4 pathways here appearing on the top of the screen that did not emerge in the respondents' top 2. And then underneath that, we'll go to the next slide, and you see the top pathways by activities. So these are the student selection of the example activities from the drag and drop screen that we showed a little bit earlier. The pathways associated with their top 2 ranked activities are shown here as their top 2 pathways by activities. The intention here is to allow the students to compare their top pathways based on conceptions versus their top pathways based on the appeal of the example activities. So here, the top 2, survey neighborhood residents regarding the effects of an issue you care about, and review the literature on best practices in order to create a policy brief. So those are the two activities that appealed the most, and community engaged learning and research, again, were one of the two top pathways on the previous screen in the earlier part of the results page. So the bottom half then of this page, where you see that the different activities I selected, everything has an associated pathway icon and color, just so it's a little bit easier and a more interesting page for students to look at. And really all this does is it merely gives students a different way of looking at how they think about the pathways, and hopefully will generate some discussion with their instructor or advisor. And finally, students can print or save their results. And we recommend this so that they'll share their results with you for advising purposes for their courses, whatever the use that you might want to use the survey with. They can use a reflection worksheet, and through the green box, they can exit to a customized local resources link, such as your campus's service learning office or community engagement center. That's something that we tailor specifically for each institution that's using the survey. So next, moving on from the survey itself, this is a very cramped list of all the institutions that have been part of our working group since 2014. There are 65 of them on this list. Currently, we have 35 colleges and universities and organizations that are using the survey for 2020, 2021. And this represents about 8,000 students that have taken the survey at the 65 institutions. So it's a mix of public and private, as you can see, and 2- and 4-year colleges and universities from around the country. So next I want to share a few uses of the framework and the survey that have been used in the past and are currently in use by some of the working group members, just to give you some ideas of how you might use the survey at your own campus. Most importantly, it's used in curricular and co-curricular settings. In looking at the list of activities that our current working group members are using, it seems that more tend to be using them in co-curricular settings this year, but it changes from year to year because it depends on which institutions are participating and how they're using the survey. A lot of institutions are using the survey in service learning or community-based learning courses. Some are using the framework with groups of student leaders, AmeriCorps members, and America Reads tutors. A few are currently using the survey in residence halls and learning communities. And several use the pathways with first-year experience programs, seminars, and orientation, freshman orientation. In terms of student advising, one university created an online catalog of civic engagement opportunities that is coded by each pathway. So students can focus on just one pathway for activities that they may want to be involved in or courses they want to take, or they can explore different pathways that any given community might offer. For program development, if a lot of students are interested in pursuing, say, social entrepreneurship, and you don't have much to offer in that area, then that's your chance to up your game and increase those kind of opportunities and experiences for your students. Also, I just want to mention for community colleges that offer career pathways or guided pathways for their students, they can overlap and complement these pathways of public service and civic engagement nicely. And finally, one aspect of growing importance to us and a big reason for the working group is research on the pathways. We look at differences and similarities among our working group members. Again, remember 2- and 4-year public and private. And they can then compare their own students' data each year with our nationally aggregated data for the entire working group. We look at trends from year to year. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Annabelle, who's going to walk you through the last year's worth of data that we've collected.
Yeah, hi everybody. This is exciting. We'll be looking at the data from 2019 and 2020, as Gail mentioned. And at the respondent level, we had 1,720 people respond to all of the pathways questions. And I've removed all of the ones that were incomplete. So generally every year, that's what I do with this data. We had 21 institutions that had respondents for the survey links. Certainly, I think more institutions that use the framework and maybe don't use the survey. with their students. These 21 institutions were mostly from 7 states. 11 were private institutions, 9 public, and we also had 1 sort of group or consortium. We mostly have 4-year institutions, but this past year, a strong showing from 2-year institutions. Then when we look at the respondent data, we can see that the majority of respondents identify as women, 34% as men, and then 2% as non-binary. Over half of the respondents are Frosh students, and so that might make sense given what Gail was saying about some institutions using it for cross the board freshman or Frosh programming. And then the sample also contains mostly non-first gen students, that's 63%. And then in the survey, students can select more than 1 response for race and ethnicity. So I've taken those responses and consolidated them into multi-race, and that constituted 10% of the sample. Mostly students, the majority identify as white. And so before I show you the data, I want to touch on some of the limitations. Of course, this information is purely self-reported by students. It's based on their students' perceptions of all of the descriptors. Similarly, there's no standardized quantity or quality of exposures to the different pathways across campuses. So we can't be sure that students are thinking of the same activities or commitments when they answer the questions. But in that vein, I do want to acknowledge the imperfect typology, as Tom was saying, that the pathways overlap. And we've, of course, done our best to define and triangulate with examples provided in the various questions that are relevant to the specific topics that the student or the respondent would choose. There is, as you saw, a question regarding their interest in social issues at the campus, regional, and global levels. These are open-ended. We intentionally leave it up to the interpretation by students so it can surface their terms and words and look at changes across time, as Gail said. Of course, very importantly, the sample is non-random. Respondents are generally students who are involved in service already, so the data can't serve as representative for the population of college students. Though we do have a few institutions that use it with all incoming Frosh. And the survey is not really set up to be used for pre and post, since we don't collect identifying information about the students and therefore can't link individuals' responses over time. Though we do have working group members who use it as a tool in pre-post scenarios and just separate the timestamps. We're mostly focused on the changes between cohorts, so Frosh is sophomore, juniors and seniors, and even graduate students. And the current analysis is useful for a snapshot of trends in a particular time period. And then we're also increasingly able to look at differences over time with multiple years of data. All right. So as you saw at the beginning of the survey, we asked students to pick and rank 12 example activities according to what they want to try or engage in. And there were 2 activities associated with each of the 6 pathways. On average, each respondent selected 4 or 5 activities, and I've added the associated pathway in the middle column here. So we can see that direct service and philanthropy and sell items and donate profits, that example from social entrepreneurship, corporate social responsibility, were most frequently selected. 80% of the about 800 people who responded to this question selected volunteer time to help on a local project you care about. I think this makes sense, especially with that largely Frosh sample, that the more hands-on helping activities, verbs like gather, donate, participate, would be most popular, since those are possibly what they have done the most of. And then activities, as you can see, from policy and governance and organizing and activism and community engaged learning and research were relatively less frequently selected. Here we go. So those were the activities. We also aggregate data from the main part of the survey, as we saw, Gail showed us, with a series of questions for each pathway. So I'll compare the various pathways across those dimensions. So first, interest. Students expressed the most interest in direct service. And then community engaged learning and research, and then the organizing and activism, philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, and policy and governance. And you'll see down here, 18% of respondents actually have no interest in policy and governance. And the divide here between none and very little, and then some and a lot, is a 51-49% situation. So I certainly wondered, how does this compare to students selecting their activities of interest from the prior slide? Remember that students were asked to pick and rank only other activities that they want to try or engage in. So I'll show you, we'll go back one. Yep, there we go. Seller is actually at the bottom, community engaged learning and research. I found that, that's kind of interesting. And maybe there's some impression of community engaged learning and research and organizing and activism that's more interesting to the respondents than the activities that we've actually identified on those pathways pages. And you might be wondering, like, how does this order of activities match up to any of the other dimensions? So we can take a look at that. The answer is not that I could tell. But here we have personal strength. And you'll see that the shape and order of the pathways graph for personal strength is actually quite similar to the interest graph. Direct service at the top, followed by community engaged learning and research, activism, philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, and policy and governance. It may be that respondents are responding to this question of how much impact they can personally have, sort of as a reflection of their level of interest in that pathway. And so we can look at how experience compares to this. You'll see that in the experience, respondents, again, express their highest level of experience in direct service by what seems to be quite a large margin. And in fact, less than 10% of the respondents indicated none for their experience in direct service. With slightly more interest in social entrepreneurship than policy and governance compared to the prior chart, but the least experience. So you'll see that 50% say they have no experience in social entrepreneurship. And so far in the last three charts, we've seen that policy and governance and social entrepreneurship share low interest, low personal strength and experience. And then the last dimension is impact. And this is the question around, how much impact do you think this pathway has on social issues in general? So lest you think that some students simply don't find certain pathways impactful, there's actually the least difference between the top and the bottom responses among perceived impact. And you'll see that well over 80% of respondents think that even the least impactful pathway has some or a lot of impact. And in fact, they think policy and governance has more impact than most of the others. It's comparable to direct service, departing from their own expressed interest, experience, and personal strength. And I have to tell you, this has been consistently true since 2015, when I first started analyzing this data. The students find policy and governance about as impactful as direct service, but express like pretty little relative interest, experience, or personal ability to have an impact in policy and governance. I think this is, especially fascinating in an election year, but interesting overall. And then one of the last questions that we saw that we ask in the survey is, of the 6 pathways, which 2 are you currently most likely to pursue after college as part of your career or personal pursuits? Some students selected more than 2, but here's a chart of how frequently each pathway was selected. A little over half selected direct service, and nearly a fifth are considering policy and governance, social entrepreneurship, and philanthropy. So again, I think policy and governance is really interesting here. Their interest is relatively low, experience is relatively low, perceived impact is high, and a good portion still indicates some likelihood of pursuing policy and governance after college. There seems to be a small but engaged group who are interested in that pathway, and sort of similar to social entrepreneurship as well. And we can also see here, students seem quite interested in organizing and activism, as well as community engaged learning and research. And they believe they can have an impact through them, have relatively little experience in them, but also can see themselves pursuing those in the future. So I think it's really interesting to compare this conclusion with those example activities at the beginning again, where students chose a community engaged learning and research activity the least frequently. The one that was at the bottom was review literature about best practices. And only about 22% of students selected that one. So I think that in aggregate, at least, this data can inform which pathways students might be encouraged to explore, really in order to define for themselves what they are. It seems like they may have an impression of some of these pathways, but really not have that much experience in them. So I will hand it over to Tom, who will speak on how he's used the data collected from one particular cohort.
Yeah, so Annabelle just shared the data as an aggregate. And so what we wanted to do is give you a sense of how at one institution we use the pathways, but also the survey results. So I will say, in addition to serving as the executive director of the Haas Center, I serve as a resident fellow in Branner Hall, which is Stanford's public service theme dorm. So every year there's about 56 students who go through this experience, it's a year-long experience, and we use the pathways as sort of an anchor for the experience. We're asking the students to go out and actually experience and sort of sample workshops or different ways in which people are involved in the 6 pathways. One of the things that we do is at the very beginning of the year, we ask them to take the survey. The other thing that we do is at one of our first group gatherings, we have these pillars in the lounge, and we ask students to go and sort of do a live version of the 4 dimensions of the question, like which do you think is most impactful, which do you have the most experience in, which are you the most interested in learning more about, that kind of thing. So people move around. There's another activity that we usually do as part of these workshops too. I want to say that's the what is service activity. If you're interested in that activity, it's actually something that's stored in our working group shared Google folder that is a really wonderful activity that gets students really thinking critically about what kinds of service do they really want to be involved in, and what are the ways in which they're thinking about that service. But the important thing here, I wanted to share with you about the cohort experience with Branner, and this is just from a couple of years ago. As you can see in real time here, what Annabelle was just seeing with the sort of national cohort, how it shows up in a local cohort. So focus in on policy and governance, and you can see that students in Branner Hall are saying, you know, policy and governance is not something that we're particularly interested in. It ranks 4th among them, but you can see it bumps up to the top thing that they think of when they think about the impact. So the way that I use this with the cohort is really to kind of share that as a problem to solve or think about. Like, why is it that you as a cohort think about it this way? I'll just put another plug into the working group that we're now seeing, where we're taking some of the quantitative data that like this kind of finding. And there's a group at George Washington University now, a graduate class that's doing qualitative studies, working on helping us figure out a qualitative mechanism for understanding why is policy and governance can, you know, so consistently have this gap between interest and perceived impact. You can go to the next slide, Annabelle. The other thing that is really nice for the students in Branner Hall is, as you know, you heard Gail say that there's this open-ended question. Well, we can do a little bit of sorting about the responses to that question, and it allows students to see, here are the things that my peers think are really important to them in kind of a bundled way. The other thing that this does for us as program administrators, my partner and I get to sort of see what are the language that students are using around these issues, and how are they relatively changing over time, the relative interest changing over time. And that helps us with our programming. If we're gonna, hey, mental health is something that's really important to students on campus, let's make sure that we're building in sort of opportunities for students to contribute to that. Let's have conversations about that. Same with economic inequality. If that's like the top concern for the group, we can actually kind of program around that. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. So we've made it through we're sort of done talking at you. Thanks for paying attention. If you are paying attention, it's hard to know. But we're excited to sort of just open it up and have any Q&A. There's a couple of things that were asked in the Q&A. We can revisit some of those questions, as well as if you just have a thought or an idea, feel free to share it with us about how you might envision working or using this framework at your campus. I want to mention too, we're sort of agnostic about whether the campus uses the tool or not. The survey tool is a great tool, but we're also open, and we want campuses that want to use this framework to sign up to be a part of that working group, even if they're just planning to use the framework, because of the conversations that we have on a quarterly basis as a working group. They've grown. I have to say, it's been really wonderful to sort of see how the campuses inform each other and sort of in their creativity about how they're doing it. Like some campuses will come up with an innovative, we use the pathways as a way of organizing our volunteer fair. And it was really helpful for the students to see, where can I go if I want to learn more about sort of the social entrepreneurship stuff or the philanthropy stuff. So that kind of cross-institutional network has been really important. So there are a couple of questions here. JR, do you want to moderate that, or should we just kind of jump in there?
Feel free to jump in, because I just put a note in the chat if folks just have thoughts too, or a general comment, because you want this to be more of a discussion as well as a Q&A for people, just to put that in there. And you and Gail and Annabelle have access to that, so it may make sense for you to, in a sense, moderate the discussion from there, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I think we should go back to the question Meredith posed, is it customizable? Because I do want to say it's customizable to a very small amount. We generally don't customize the language around the pathways, because we need to keep that consistent. So for the comparative purposes, if one campus says, well, I want to add a different pathway, or I want to change the definition, we don't do that, just because it then sort of negates the applicability of any kind of cross-institution comparison. We'll also say that the definitions end up being relatively less important. People really focus in on the examples that are given when they're thinking about that. But Annabelle or Gail, can you say a little bit more? Because there are parts of like the landing page that are customizable, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one thing that I definitely want to mention is that, and that thought completely left my head right now. So with the landing page, because we create through Qualtrics a specific link for each institution that's a member of the working group, you receive that link. I would send that to you with other working group information, which is a little bit later on this slide, and I could talk about it in a second. But the part that really is specifically customizable is at the end, at the results page, which I showed earlier, that there's a box that then extends students right back to your service learning office, your leadership office, the honors program, wherever you're housing activities that focus on this, and that's completely up to you how you want to do that. One of the other reasons that we don't do some specific customizing in the summertime, so most institutions are using the survey and the framework during the course of, from August or September through May or June. And then in the summer, we get feedback from all the working group members. And if there's a question that just doesn't seem right, or a different example that they want to add, we'll take a look at those, and with the working group, make tweaks to the survey for the following year. So what you see generally with the descriptions and the definitions of the pathways, those are ones that the working group has decided and come to consensus to over the 7 years that we've been doing the framework and the pathways and the survey.
Yeah, I just want to echo quickly what Gail was saying about the customizability of the landing page afterwards. When students click the Visit Local Resources button, you could take them to a campus-specific pathways page. I think we've had a few working group members who have done this, and I think it could be really effective, because the first thing they see is these pathways by description, their top ones, and then the next thing, if they click the landing page, it would go to Indiana University and the different opportunities maybe that are categorized by pathways, and that might make it easier for people to connect sort of the intellectual understanding to the local application.
I'm gonna go to some of the open questions. Joanne Novak asks, could you talk more about the random survey work you've done to get students not already interested or engaged in social change? None, really. This would be a really good, actually, Annabelle or Gail, you can contradict me if there is something, but really, from my perspective, there's not, we're mostly working through cohorts or classes that are doing this. There's a few campuses, like Annabelle said, that actually use this with an entire incoming class. And that would be more of the randomized, where you're getting a whole cohort like that. But this would be a great thing for a campus to do if they could figure out ways to actually do more of a random sampling of this. But it hasn't been something we've done intentionally to date. Am I right, Gail and Annabelle?
Yeah.
You want to take the next one? The
So,
question listing of concern, issues of concern.
yeah. We haven't in the past done something in between campus, region, and world. That's certainly something that we could consider again in the summertime when we're looking at how people use the survey and the results. So if you join the working group, then we'd encourage you to come on and start that conversation. That may be something that other working group members have thought of, but just haven't brought up before. So we encourage that kind of collaborative effort and questioning, because it helps us improve the survey every year. And that also gets to Meredith's next question about the examples under each pathway. We've changed those over the last couple of years to try to be broader, and well, they're broader and more specific both, because now that because we used to only have a generic version of the survey, and now we have these 6 different topic areas, so that it's health, and I'm going to look at this real quick. Education and youth development, they would answer all questions that are given examples with those areas. Environmental sustainability, health, diversity, equity, and inclusion, human services, and then again, a general one. So we can always add new examples, because again, we want to appeal to the broadest number of students. So somebody can say if it's a first generation English language learning student who's 35 years old, we want to give them an example where they can see themselves doing that. And that's what we've tried to be pretty intentional about doing.
One of the interesting things that's been fun and also really challenging across the working group doing is on the examples, we've got to be careful not to have some of the examples, particularly for one pathway, to be really exciting examples and others not, because that's going to influence. So it is actually kind of you're walking a tightrope there, where for a while we were like really generic about everything, but it was hard to get through because it felt really boring, and it was like, I don't really understand, like it's not helping me understand this pathway. But as Gail said, yeah, some of that's the work of the working group right there, is to figure out how can we be consistent about how we're portraying it. And the examples, like I said, are really important for how people understand what that pathway really is. It's more important than the definition. There's a question here about what departments do working group members typically come from?
They're all over the place. I mean, it tends to be just more folks who are involved in service learning and community engagement, writ large. Some are faculty, some are staff, some are administrators. It's whoever is on a webinar like this or comes to a conference when we had conferences and finds that interesting. And then at certain institutions it grows, and at some it's just a couple of folks that are using it. So for example, there's one college that has come on this year for the first time, and they're going to use the survey with 10 students. And then there are others that use it with 400 students, their entire freshman class. So it's kind of all over the place. I'm seeing Q&A that's coming up about a state cohort referring to a campus compact chapter. That's the state campus compact. Yeah. Since we're getting close to time, let me answer go to the options about joining the working group really quick. So if you're interested in working or in joining the working group, I've got 2 options here. Most of our members are individual institutions, again, from all over the country. You saw that big list of 65. You sign a 1-page working group agreement that's as simple as we can make it. It's not an MOU per se. the person who signs it, it's up to your institution. We don't mandate any, any particular person. It's usually the person who's going to be using the survey in one way or the other. Then you give us like a short description, 1 paragraph of how you plan to use the framework and the survey and the number of students you expect to participate. We provide you with a unique link for your institution for the survey, and then you provide us an exit link that students would go to from the results page. And as being part of the working group, you can have up to 2 representatives from your institution that has access to the Qualtrics data. That's those unique links. And you're part of the working group so that you can participate in our quarterly Zoom calls, and also have access to the working group resources that we have on a Google Drive. And it's really cool, some of the things that people have posted. We learn a lot about all different ways, because there's no one way to use these. There's an infinite way to use the pathways. So for individual institutions, you would submit that. If you have a state cohort, a state campus compact, for example, this year we have Wisconsin Campus Compact as a cohort with 4 member institutions, all of which are using this survey and still have to submit everything in the individual institutions bullet. But the director of Campus Compact for Wisconsin also is a member of the working group, and he has access to that Qualtrics data as well. So he can look at, you would look at your individual institution data. The state compact director could look at the state as a cohort, and then Annabelle creates at the end, usually in the fall, the data that you've just seen today, the aggregated data from all of the working groups across the country, or the working group institutions across the country. And one quick thing, and Tom mentioned this before, we are requesting a membership fee of $200 this year for the first time, to cover administrative costs for the working group and the data and results and survey management. So that's the quick stuff. And I'm the primary contact if you're interested. So let's switch to the next slide real quick. If you are interested in just finding out a little bit more about the pathways, looking at the agreement, just email me and I'll send that stuff out to you. Excuse me, happy to have a conversation by phone or Zoom if that's also easier. Okay, so now we can get back to other Q&A real quick. Thanks.
Well, let me just say, Emily had asked about the state cohort, and does that reference a Campus Compact chapter, like a state compact?
It's the state compact.
Yeah, that's what we're referencing, but if the idea is there some other, maybe it's a local cohort or state, like we'd be open to other groups. We are at Campus Compact right now, so I want to put a plug in for Campus Compact. But it could be that you've got maybe a series of colleges that are doing other collective work, and it might make sense for them to do this collectively. I want to also mention, Gail has mentioned the sort of the network, and I think we've all sort of said a little bit about how that network has congealed. Last year, we did something that we'd been going around to conferences talking about the pathways. And, people were excited about it, but it just didn't grow that much. But this last year, what we did was we hosted a retreat and an institute at Stanford. And I can tell you that it absolutely helped to have people connecting with each other, talk personally, and just sort of figuring out, like, how do we use this and what kind of research can we do. And this year, I'm excited to say the University of Pittsburgh has decided they're going to take this and run with it, and they're hosting the next retreat in January. And so this has become very much a learning community. And I think I'm really excited about the prospect of adding new campuses that might be interested in using this, and however you're thinking about using it. Are there new questions?